Good evening. Jó estét kívánok. Tonight I'll be speaking only in English. I was trying to sort of overhear or eavesdrop the introductions, and so that I don't repeat the same thing. But before George is coming to the stage to read for you, partly from Krasznahorkai's work, I would like to say a few words about George, who I have known personally for about 25 years. I think when the Liszt Institute asked me to have a conversation with George, they weren't aware of this very fact that we've known each other for 25 years. So a huge welcome to you all tonight and to this essential conversation, hopefully, on literature, language, and the alchemy of literary translation. We have this amazing opportunity of hosting George Szirtes, who you have heard is not only a celebrated poet, but a massive conduit for Hungarian literature. So we're talking in the conversation later today. I will be focusing on two main sort of components of George's oeuvre. On the one hand, I would like to sort of focus on George as an Anglophone poet, a British poet, writing I don't know how many decades now, mainly poetry in the English language, winning prizes that you've heard, for example, for Reel, the T.S. Eliot Prize. By the way, for various other, I was trying to look at the list a couple of days ago. There isn't a collection which wasn't in one way or another shortlisted for some sort of prize. So, for example, not only did the Reel win the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is the highest prize in England, in the UK, for poetry. I know this because I'm likely never going to get it. So, but also lots of T.S. Eliot shortlists, Forward Prize shortlists, and so on. We should also mention the prose in English, particularly The Photographer at 16, which was also the kind of prize winner for two major awards. And of course, then the whole sort of a poetic oeuvre and achievement has been recently crowned by the King's Gold Medal for Poetry. I actually had the opportunity just to have a conversation with George about how it went. Apparently it was very brief, 10 minutes, but it was all nice and smart. So that's the poetry package. And then, of course, when we talk about George Szirtes, we cannot not talk about literary translation, particularly from, obviously, the Hungarian language, which has also, along with the poetry collections, reshaped the English literary landscape. I was overhearing that in the introduction to George Krasznahorkai was mentioned, but I've got about a 3-4 pages long list of texts George has been translating from Hungarian literature since the early 1990s, I would say, if I'm correct. The first text was Madácsi's Ember tragédiája, Tragedy of Man, and then lots of poetry collections, recently by Christina Toth, which was shortlisted for the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation in 2025, and various other texts. I actually brought this with me because I wrote my PhD on Ágnes Lehóczky. George actually translated a full collection by Ágnes Lehóczky and her poetry. And then, of course, there is the Márai texts, Zsuzsa Rakowski. The list is really endless, and I must say that all kind of accompanied by some sort of prestigious translation prize. For example, the Man Booker International Prize in 2014, or the Dairy Prize, the Weidenfeld Prize, the Forward Prize, and so on. And thirdly, which is more just a personal comment, a lot of you might not know that we also have to celebrate George as a mentor, university tutor, a teacher. So George taught creative writing at the University of East Anglia, and he taught me 20 years ago in 2006 for the MA in creative writing, and later on also he was a supervisor for various projects, particularly for my Nemes Nagy project and doctorate. So we're talking about a trio here, so poet, translator, mentor. I'd like you to welcome George with warmth, and what's going to happen is George is going to come to the mic and give you a little sample, a little taster. We'll start with work from the Krasznahorkai text, and once that's over, we're going to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My first task is to read some passages out of Krasznahorkai's work. I've decided to actually chiefly concentrate on az ellenállás melankóliája, the melancholy of resistance, chiefly because it's the book with which I began. It's also easier to sort of pick little excerpts from this than it is from Satantango. Satantango, marvelous book, and his actual first book, chronologically, is a kind of it's enormous themes, and its episodes have a kind of monumentality and a scale to them. But I'll read you a little bit of that if there is time. I thought I might begin. I've got two passages from Melancholy of Resistance. I read the very first passage from the book, chiefly because that is where I began as a translator. So these words that I'm going to read are the very first words I translated. It's the beginning of the novel. And I don't know how many people here have read the book, but this will set you up perhaps to the disorganized, chaotic, desolate nature of the place. Since the passenger train connecting the ice-bound estates of the southern lowlands, which extend from the banks of the Tisa almost as far as the foot of the Carpathians, had, despite the garbled explanations of a haplessly stumbling guard and the promises of the station master rushing nervously on and off the platform, failed to arrive. Well, Squire, it seems to have disappeared into thin air again, the guard shrugged, pulling a sour face. The only two serviceable old wooden-seated coaches maintained for just such an emergency were coupled to an obsolete and unreliable 424, used only as a last resort, and put to work, albeit a good hour and a half late, according to a timetable to which they were not bound, and which was only an approximation anyway, so that the locals who were waiting in vain for the eastbound service and had accepted in delay what appeared to be a combination of indifference and helpless resignation, might eventually arrive at their destination some 50 kilometers further along the branch line. First sentence. I will read you something of the second sentence. To tell the truth, none of this really surprised anyone anymore, since rail travel, like everything else, was subject to the prevailing conditions. All normal expectations went by the board, and one's daily habits were disrupted by a sense of ever-spreading, all-consuming chaos, which rendered the future unpredictable, the past unrecollectable, and ordinary life so haphazard that people simply assumed that whatever could be imagined might come to pass, that if there were only one door in a building, it would no longer open, that wheat would grow head downwards into the earth, not out of it, and that since one could only note the symptoms of disintegration, the reasons for it remaining unfathomable and inconceivable, there was nothing anyone could do except to get a tenacious grip on anything that was still tangible. That's not the end of the sentence, it carries on. But you begin to get maybe a sense of proportion and a sense of the distances which a transcendence can travel. I know that Agi is going to be playing a little bit of one of the Béla Tarr films, which is based on this book, although reduced. The film is called The Werkmeister Harmonies. And there's this wonderful scene, which is equally beautiful in film, but we will probably talk a little bit about the relationship between the films and the text, in which he's not a simpleton, really. He's a young man who sort of delivers papers and delivers post. He's called Valushka. I think there is now an opera called Valushka. And he's invited into this pub, the Pfeffer, basically, where everybody's totally drunk. They can hardly stand up. But they invite him in, they welcome him. Because when he comes, he enacts the eclipse of the sun. And he gets them, each of them, to play one of the planets. So I'll give you a little bit of this. So he's appointed, somebody is the sun, somebody is the moon, somebody is the earth, or the earth, as it has now, because they speak in a kind of, I'm not going to do the accent, but it's, you know, it's not pure Budapest or definitely not pure London. So, though even this did not go without the odd hiccup, for while the roguishly grinning figure of Earth confronted his slowly sobering audience and completed the complex maneuver of 2 orbits around the lanky sun with embarrassing and acrobatic ease, the moon keeled over, as if poleaxed by news of some terrible misfortune as soon as Valushka touched him. And despite every well-intentioned precaution, all attempts to set him on his feet again proved sad failures, so that even he, in the midst of his enthusiastic running about and inspired, if constantly stuttering monologue, had to admit it might be better to replace the heavily indisposed warehouseman with some more useful assistant. At this moment, however, just when the delight of the audience was reaching its peak, the moon pulled himself together, and as if he had discovered a potent remedy for his acute dizziness, altered the disposition of his squat legs, and turning at an acute angle, launched himself, albeit in the wrong direction, into orbit, and beginning to spin, got so carried away with the process that his movements, which resembled nothing so much as the steps of the familiar Czardas, suggested he was quite capable of carrying on for some time in this manner, and what was more, he had even recovered his powers of speech to some degree. Eventually everything was ready, and Valushka, having stood aside for half a minute or so to wipe his sweating brow, for he didn't want to run the risk of even momentarily preventing anyone enjoying the glorious spectacle of the heavenly harmony of earth, moon, and sun in such carefully planned conjunction, got down to the business in hand. Briefly raising his cap, he smoothed his hair back out of his eyes, swept his arms dramatically before him to recall what he sincerely felt to be everyone's rapt attention, and animated by the intense flame within him, lifted his flushed face heavenwards and begins to speak. At first, so to speak, we hardly realize the extraordinary events to which we are witness, he began rather quietly. And hearing his whisper, everyone immediately stopped speaking in anticipation of the storms of laughter to come. The brilliant light of the sun, his broad gesture took in the driver, who ground his teeth, struggling against the sea of troubles besetting him, and extended to the hypnotically circling figure of the house painter, floods earth with warmth and light, the side of earth facing us, that is. He greatly studied the lewdly grinning representations of earth, and turned him to face the sun, then stepped behind him, leaning on him, almost embracing him. And he goes on now and delivers the eclipse in tones of awe. An interesting thing about this passage, which is so funny, and it's funny in the film as well, is that this is a key passage for the construction of the book. Almost everything within the book is linked to another part of its construction. So that at the very end, there's a professor of music who is looking for perfect natural tuning. He's seeking systems. And at the very end, there's a funeral in which the person we first meet on that train is being buried, and somebody gives an oration. And at the end of the oration, Krasznahorkai gives a most extraordinary chapter, which is not about the characters, it's not about the fiction, it is about the decomposition of the body. He describes the decomposition of the body for a chapter, but in kind of dramatic narrative terms. So at the very end of the book, you finish up with a little piece of carbon at the end of a sentence, and this is the sentence over which that piece of carbon forms a full stop. Time for one more? Okay, please keep a track of the time. I don't want to fully occupy the space. All right, I'll give you another piece of this. This is one of my favorite parts. When I first started translating Krasznahorkai, people asked me, people in Hungary, why do you want to translate this depressing writer? And he's not. I mean, he is and he isn't. I mean, he is, as people say, he's apocalyptic. But at the same time, he's funny. And just as that scene with the planets, people pretending to be drunken people pretending to be planets, is funny. Here we have the music professor. Lehóczky, who I've mentioned, informs him that there's going to be a riot in town. This is the original first English edition of the poem, and on it, it has a whale. That figurative and real whale is at the very heart of the story. And it's the followers of that whale who are going to riot and create violence and terrible violence in the town. Now the trouble is, Lehóczky tells him, you must board up your windows because of the riot. People are going to come here and smash things up. But he has never handled a hammer, never beaten a nail with a piece of hammer, so he doesn't know what to do. I'll select a little passage. It goes on for about 2.5 pages, one man hitting nails with one hammer. So he had already hit himself on the thumb about 20 times. And then he thinks logically, because he's a logical thinker. This is him thinking, the arc to be controlled is the one that determines the relationship between the head of the instrument and the head of the nail, he decided, contemplating the problem for a few moments. And while his thoughts slowly returned to the matter of minor adjustments, using all the power of his injured left hand to thrust the plank up against the window frame, he blindly swung the hammer with his right. This did not result in any greater damage than had already been inflicted, and what was more, the nail had sank a little further into the wood. But as to the previously traditional-sounding idea of channeling the remnants of his already wandering attention into the genuinely valuable effort of observing the so-called arc, he thought better of it. After all, the hammer in his hand felt increasingly unsteady, and the results of such experimentation would become ever more unpredictable. So After the third effort, he had to admit that the fact that he hadn't missed a nail in 3 successive goes, far from being due to his level of concentration, was probably down to sheer luck, or to employ his own formulation, to a certain benevolent grace that offered him a moment of respite before he systematically beat his fingers to a pulp. Goes on. So he carries on trying to fix up this boarding against invading hordes. One tiny bit, well, I'll do a little bit from Satantango, and then we can do the conversation. So I translated this book first. This is not in the chronology of the Hungarian publication, because this was the first book, but this was the third I translated. The second book was called Háború és háború, War and War, which I think is a tremendously good book, but it gets far less attention than these two books do. What shall I say about Satantango? You must imagine a run-down ex-cooperative farm, which is muddy all the time, and the people who are left behind don't know what to do. They've saved some money. Some people want to steal the money. But what they're waiting for are these two people, these two trickster sort of figures, who are clever, who will turn up and will rescue them when they arrive. And basically, we are waiting for these two to turn up, and they do turn up in the end. And of course, it doesn't help. So this is how the book begins. One morning, near the end of October, not long before the first drops of the mercilessly long autumn rains began to fall on the cracked and saline soil on the western side of the estate, later the stinking yellow sea of mud would render footpaths impassable and put the town too beyond reach, Futaki woke to hear bells. The closest possible source was a lonely chapel about 4 kilometers southwest on the old Hochmeich's estate. But not only did that have no bell, but the tower had collapsed during the war, and at that distance it was too far to hear anything. And in any case, they did not sound distant to him, these ringing, booming bells. Their triumphal clangor was swept along by the wind and seemed to come from somewhere close by. It's as if they were coming from the mill. He propped himself on his elbows on his pillows so as to look out through the mousehole-sized kitchen window that was partly misted up, and directed his gaze to the faint blue dawn sky, but the field was still and silent, bathed only in a no ever fainter bell sound, and the only light to be seen was one glimmering in the doctor's window, whose house was set well apart from the others on the far side, and that was only because its occupant had for years been unable to sleep in the dark. So that's how we begin. Futaki, I should mention, has just slept with one of his neighbor's wives, and he's waiting for the neighbor to come back. I'm going to go straight to the end of this. There are marvelous scenes in this. You probably know that the film is quite long. It's 7.25 hours long. And it is magnetic once you allow yourself to be gripped by this. I've now seen it twice. There's a sort of very formal plot structure to the book. And you began with that piece of description. And I think what I'd like to, yes, let's pick it up from here. So the doctor was mentioned in that first passage. The doctor returns at the end. The doctor, it turns out, is a kind of recorder of everything that happens in the town. He's a very drunk doctor. He's a badly smoking doctor. He can't be long for this world, but he's the observer figure. So let's pick it up from, say, here. So we're with the doctor now, the doctor we first met. Damn it, he groaned. He took a box of nails from under the wardrobe, and with a few nails in one hand and a hammer in the other, went over to the door and started beating in the nails with increasing fury. Having finished, he calmly returned to his chair, covered his back with the blankets, and mixed another drink, this time after some consideration in half-half proportion. He gazed and thought, then suddenly his eyes brightened, and he took out a new notebook. It was raining when, he wrote, then shook his head and crossed it out. It was raining when Futaki awoke, and he tried again. But he decided, this is poor stuff. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, adjusted his glasses, then propped his elbows on a table and put his head in his hands. He saw before him, as clear as if by magic, the path prepared for him, the way the fog swam up from either side of it, and in the middle of the narrow path, the luminous face of his future, its lineaments bearing the infernal marks of drowning. He reached for the pencil again and felt he was back on track now. There were enough notebooks, enough palinka. His medication would last till spring at least, and unless the nails rotted in the door, no one would disturb him. Careful not to damage the paper, he started writing. One morning, near the end of October, not long before the first drips of the mercilessly long autumn rains began to fall, on a cracked and saline soil on the western side of the estate, later the stinking yellow sea of mud would render footpaths impassable and put the town too beyond reach. Futaki woke to hear bells, and so it goes on. That's the first paragraph of the book, and you are hearing it again. I think I'll stop now and sit down and talk to Agi.
Thank you. I've poured you some water as well, just in case. Would you like some now? Or? Yeah, there you go. Okay, so we've prepared with a little conversation, but I'm smirking and smiling because George knows what you've done here, that I've been preparing for these questions for some time now. And I was given about an hour and 15 minutes. And a couple of days ago, I rehearsed my questions, and just the questions went up to about 55 minutes. So I think I'm going to simplify the questions for you tonight. George was very reluctant to focus on the poet, the writer in English, the British poet tonight, but in my mind, the writer, the poet is inseparable from the translator, particularly with the complex sort of origin and identity you have. I myself can sort of identify with a little bit. And also I just wanted to say that regarding the poet's inseparability from the translator, you don't know that I first read Krasznahorkai in your translation. I didn't read it in Hungarian first. So I knew Krasznahorkai through your translation first, and then I went back and read the kind of original texts in Hungarian. Not all of them, of course. So I'm going to kick off with this seemingly simple, but probably rather complex question, the inseparability of the writer and from the translator, but with the additional complexity that you also have got a dual heritage. So you left Hungary as a refugee in 1956. I think with my maths, you were 8 years old. So I'm really interested in how literary translation informs the poetry and vice versa, but with the additional complexity of the writer with a dual heritage linguistically. And I'm always wondering, since I have known you, how the two languages, the sort of what we might call the linguistic unconscious, and it's two because it's double, how they operate underneath.
Right. Well, is that okay? Can you hear me fine? Okay. I was only just 8 when we arrived here. I mean, we arrived, my parents decided that we should speak English at home as soon as possible. And I stopped speaking Hungarian. For 28 years, I didn't speak Hungarian. I lost an awful lot of vocabulary. So I began writing my own poetry when I was 17. So I was writing for about 10 years. My first book came out when I was 28, 29. And after 3 books, I wanted to revisit Hungary. I'd read quite a lot about Hungary in preparation. I didn't ever think I would want to do this, but I did. So in 1984, I, with my wife and 2 young children at the time, we went to Budapest, where I was born. And I was there I went there with an Arts Council fellowship. But then I also got to meet the British Council. And the British Council representative, who was a very good, very nice man called Keith Dobson, who had learned Hungarian, he threw a party for me up in Buda. And at the end of the party, a man came up to me called Vajda Miklós Vajda, and he asked, how would you like to translate a few poems? That first visit to Hungary was so dizzyingly important. I mean, it was like being in a hallucination for 3 weeks. That, if they had asked me to do the washing up for the next 10 years, I'd have said, of course I'll do it. So I said, okay. And he gave me 4 poems by Kosztolányi Dezső. And because my Hungarian was far from good, I was given help by people who gave me literal readings and notes and so forth. And I translated them. And that was a decisive moment in my life in many ways, that first 1984 visit. It did completely change my life in that from that point on, I became a translator as well as a poet. I was always a poet first, but I was a poet who translated. And I had to learn about translation. Not in an academic way, I've never studied it. But I began very shortly after Kosztolányi, and the Hungarian Quarterly, which Miklós was editing, was as the name suggests, quarterly. So every quarter he would ask me to translate some poems, contemporary poems, which I did. And at a certain point, they asked, have a look at some translations of Madách, Ember Tragédiája, The Tragedy of Man. So I did. And then they said, well, would you like to translate it? And because I was saying okay to everything, I said, yes, okay. And I did. That took about 2 or 3 years. So that's how that started. As to the core of your question, I wasn't sure, I'm still not entirely sure, to what degree the reading of Hungarian, the translation of Hungarian, and the speaking of Hungarian influenced what I did. But I do know that the poems I translated, I learned from them. You can't help but learn. You're essentially learning other people's voices and other people's habits of speech, and other people's idiosyncrasies. And in some ways, these are bound to enter into yours quite unconsciously, I think. Although in some cases, translating certain poets, there was something they were doing which I liked. And I thought, oh, I'm going to try this. And so that happened too. But the two areas were separate in my mind. And I was always thinking, well, and I was always being asked to translate particular things. It wasn't I who was suggesting what I should do. That came later. So it was a way of learning Hungarian. I should say one thing, and then I'll hand back to you, Agi, which is that when I first went back to Hungary, not having spoken a language at all for 28 years, what I found is I kind of understood about 60, 70%. I could only speak about 10, 15%. But I could hear tone. I could hear irony, for example. So in a way, I had not forgotten such things. And at what had vanished over years, not completely vanished, but eroded, was vocabulary. And that, to some degree, the habits, the manners, the rhetoric of Hungarian speech and Hungarian writing were not completely unnatural.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to talking about László Krasznahorkai. I was just thinking as I was listening to you, literally you were relearning Hungarian from Krasznahorkai's novels, which is quite spectacular, quite an achievement. But anyhow, so let's move on to your work with László, or Laci as you call him, and on his work. So we're talking about 3 novels: Melancholy of Resistance, Satantango, Satantango, and War, not in that order. So I'm just thinking about the historic context here. What's the story behind your meeting, the kind of 30s or Szirtes Krasznahorkai pact? How did it start? When did it start? How did it unfold?
I was commissioned by English publisher to translate Ellenállás Melancholy. And I had not read any Krasznahorkai. And I didn't, in fact, read the book first. I hardly ever do. This is very unprofessional. I don't advise it. But it's what I've done all my life. I just start at page 1 and see how it goes. And I hope that by page 2, I have understood something useful. I've understood what somebody's up to, basically, which is the chief thing. If you're translating poetry, I think that's one of the key things. You read the thing and you're trying to understand somebody's mind. What is it that it's doing and how it's doing it? So that's how it was. And the passage which I read to you just there was the very first paragraph that I translated from Krasznahorkai. I didn't know him. It's anybody who's read Krasznahorkai on the page will know that you run against 2 problems: incredibly long sentences and no paragraphs. So trying to follow a text like that it's exhausting. I think I said I'd do it in 18 months, but I think it took me 4 years. And one day, Krasznahorkai, for the first time, rang up and said hello. And I immediately apologized. I'm so sorry. I'm terribly, terribly sorry. And he said, no, don't worry. It took you 4 years to translate, but it took me 6 years to write. So he laughed it off, and he was very understanding. So it was a blessed thing, because because he understood the nature of one of the really lovely things that let's see if I'll call him that sometimes, is that he reckoned that the translator is in fact the other writer. So they're not simply a kind of machine or slave or servant, as somebody like Nabokov had it. He reckoned his translators were servants who didn't behave themselves. But he appreciated that he was writing as well as translation. And he trusted his translators. His current translator, Ottilie Mulzato, I think is brilliant. He trusts her. He didn't speak very much English himself. So it was a kind of half-half conversation. So that's how it began. So that's with that publisher, which I think was called Quartet, which doesn't exist now. And the American publisher, New Directions, took him on. And then everything I did was for New Directions. It took less time, but it was just as exhausting, which is one of the reasons I actually stopped after Satantango was the last proper novel of his translated. I translated novellas, short stories, even articles for papers. But he makes you work. Probably makes you work as well if you're a reader.
Did you discuss the work in progress at all between the two of you, or
No,
he just left you
just left me to it.
to it? Okay.
If I had a particular problem, I could ask him. But I tried to arrange it so I didn't have too many particular problems. Most of the translation which I had done in poetry was translations from dead authors. Dead authors don't quarrel. They're the safest people. So, and Lutzi was living. I translated a Hungarian poet called, later he's dead now, poet chap, Peter Cantor, who was very good. But Peter was very precise. His rival of English, his knowledge of English rivaled mine, or at least so believed. So it could be difficult, but Lutzi didn't. I mean, I think he only saw the translation when it was done. So there weren't a lot of consultations. Again, I don't recommend this. It is an idiosyncratic way of working. But there we are. I mean, having said all that, I go back to these things and I keep thinking, oh, I could have done that better. I could have done that better. If I had a bit more time, I would have written that sentence slightly differently. And that will probably never, ever go.
Let's just move on quickly to talking about the too difficult label. I was reading one of Ottilie's comment about, can we please stop talking about Krasznahorkai as being too difficult? I've had enough of hearing that, which I kind of agree with. But let's go back to the kind of 1990s and early 2000s when you were working on these texts, and for years you were working on these texts. So did you, lots of sub-questions here, George, what was your first reaction to start with when you were encountering these texts, these strange stories, that incredibly complex labyrinthine syntax? But obviously intuitively, we're thinking now retrospectively, did you know you are dealing with a Nobel Prize material?
No. No. That became clearer to me as time went on, partly because other people told me that he was in discussion, or as people were discussing him in that regard. And I thought, well, he might. I mean, I remember when the first Hungarian winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Imre Kertész, 2002. So that's not that long. That's quite something. But he's such a kind of sui generis sort of writer. And he has such an he's a visionary writer. His incidents, by giving you an incident, I'm giving you a moment out of something which is actually sort of enormous. And you know that passage about the sun, the eclipse, that passage is emblematic of the way he thinks. It's emblematic of the way he constructs. So, yes, I knew I was dealing with an extraordinary writer. And perhaps I'll say one other thing at this point, which is related, that when the first two Krasznahorkais in my translation came out, Melancholy of Resistance and War, it was reviewed, but in little reviews like that. They were very enthusiastic. And then came Satantango. And at that point, Susan Sontag wrote a big article in the Times Literary Supplement, and that was like an explosion. And since then, he has been a writer for our age.
I'm glad you've mentioned Susan Sontag, because that fits in perfectly with the next question, which is moving on to and also you mentioned the word visionary. You mentioned Susan Sontag, we mentioned the sort of difficulty of and the complexity of the syntax. So that's my next little conversation or topic, syntax versus or in relation to the vision. And I was wondering, when it comes to literary canon, where would you position this sort of literary visionary series of texts by Krasznahorkai? I mean, I'm a massive fan of his work, but also because I have read similar texts. I'm thinking here, and I might be completely wrong, but I'm thinking here of Thomas Bernhard,
Yes.
Sebald, Joyce, Proust. We are going back in time, obviously. Kafka. Susan Sontag, I think the article you mentioned or the text you mentioned, I think she calls him the Hungarian Gogol. Others kind of compare his work with sort of postmodern Dostoevsky. And so, but we'll talk about the kind of isolatedness of the Hungarian, and therefore,
I say just something.
Go on.
Gogol, Sebald, who I knew, he was a colleague of mine at the university, and whose books I very much admired. And I think there is a point of if you like, a kind of romantic similarity in perception. Because after all, I think what writers do, really good writers, when we talk about vision, it's a way of understanding the world. And the way that Sebald understood the world is not dissimilar. In fact, I believe I was the one who introduced them.
Oh, wow.
Because Krasznahorkai came to England, came to see us and stayed a night with us in Windham, which is a small town on the edge of Norwich. And he came to do a talk at the UEA, the university, while I was teaching, where Sebald was teaching. And Sebald had an interesting similar career. He'd written 2 or 3 books, which are marvelous books, but nobody took very much notice. And then Sontag, once again, the great kingmaker, she wrote a huge article about Sebald, and suddenly he was a world star. And Sebald, when the first book, Melancholy of Resistance, came out, the publisher asked me, can you think of somebody who could write what they call a blurb, the bit at the back of the book? And I thought, well, maybe Sebald, Max, as we knew him. And so I asked the publisher to send it to Sebald. But I forgot to tell Sebald. And the book arrived, and after a while, it's a little bit like Krasznahorkai, I got a telephone call from Sebald. Was it you who arranged to send this book to me? I said, yes. I'm sorry. I always seem to be saying I'm sorry. But it's a wonderful book, he said. And he wrote the book in there. And you know who he compares him to? Gogol. So you get Gogol twice. It's to do with scope. It's to do with the fact and that what Sebald says about him, is that his concerns are beyond the concerns of everyday literature. So he's not writing the Jane Austen of the universe. No, he's a big scale writer, just as Max is, as Sebald is, and the other people we mentioned. So he belongs in that sort of company.
Moving on to picking up on your final thought on vision and the kind of otherness of Krasznahorkai compared to what I would call the mainstream. We talked a lot about syntax already, and we talked about Sebald as well. I think there's quite a bit of a similarity between.
There is. Just on syntax, and maybe sorry, I forgot to address your question about syntax. Syntax in Hungarian is different from syntax in English. So the basic difficulty with a very long sentence is to decide where it begins, which is the middle, and which is the end. And because you have to read a long way down to say, where do I pick up the track of this sentence? Which is what is so tiring. It is working out, and your eyes have to move all over this. And I know that Hungarian can write in that slightly Germanic way. I was once asked briefly to look over a book of essays about Hungarian art by a Hungarian art historian. And it was terrible. I mean, it was just like walking through thick mud, the prose, because it was grandiose. But then again, it was fiddly. So there is, but then you learn maybe that is as a friend of mine explained to me, this is, if you like, the German aspect of style, the German influence on Hungarian literature. English, well, does English, I mean, I don't mean of the English language. Does it do it? Not very much. Kind of English modesty. I'm not going to go on too long. I should stop this sentence now. It may have been slightly more natural in Hungarian than it is in English, which is one of the reasons, possibly, that sometimes Krasznahorkai in English can seem funny. Like that long passage about the man trying to board up his window. I think that's very, very funny. I'm not sure how funny Hungarians think it is, but I think they must do, surely. You can't spend 3 pages on somebody trying to bang a nail into a piece of wood. So there's something happens between the Hungarian and the English. I can't tell exactly what it is.
Well, I will come back to the whole question on humor, particularly on Hungarian humor in a second. But before that, let's talk about something a little bit more somber or complicated or darker, perhaps, which is exactly the vision we're coming to now, to the main question, which is, so recently you often hear the words apocalypsis, cathartic, catharsis, apocalypsis, or you hear metaphysics without metaphysics, philosophical, overcomplicated, visionary, apocalyptic visionary. All these things you must have seen recently in various major articles, particularly since the Nobel Prize. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, or ask you to talk a little bit about this sort of apocalyptic view. And it was really interesting that before I heard the Nobel Prize speech by him, by László Krasznahorkai, I already was thinking of 1940s essay by Walter Benjamin.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And in that, a thesis on the philosophy of history. And in that, Benjamin already talks about, which Benjamin is somebody, I think, very similar to Krasznahorkai and Sebald and so on, anybody visionary and apocalyptic, including yourself, by the way, which we haven't talked about yet, your own work. So in that, there is a passage in which Benjamin describes time through a metaphor or an allegory, and he kind of ekphrastically zooms on a Paul Klee image of the history of angel. And I feel the need to, if you're okay with it, to read it out, because it's just so beautiful. I teach it to my students just to kind of uplift the mood in the class. So he says about this angel, a Klee painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he's fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. You know this, I'm sure. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. And I might just be forging this on the Krasznahorkai vision or visionary map. But then I heard him talking about the angels without the metaphysical aspect in the Nobel Prize talk. Wonderful, wonderful talk. Gave me the goosebumps, actually. So is this possible that actually we might use the term apocalypsis or apocalyptic vision wrongly, and it's more of the Benjaminian concept, that it's a cycle? We are actually kind of sandwiched in between catastrophes, and therefore it's not apocalyptic but post-apocalyptic.
I don't think there's anything in his writing which talks to us as though we were living at a time when terrible disasters might overtake us. I mean, we ourselves may feel like it sometimes, but that is not his direct interest, I think. I think he's a great artist of disintegration. So, for example, in that very first passage that I read to you, all these people are waiting for a train. Will the train appear? There's a timetable. Does a timetable mean anything? It doesn't mean anything. And then they go through in a second sentence. He begins to say, if there's a door in the house, if there's only one door in the house, it won't open. And then it's extraordinary thing, then wheat will grow upside down. And you think, whoa, this is another aspect or another level of apocalypse. We are on the edge. It is, I think, essentially the Benjaminian sort of understanding of apocalypse, although the riot in Melancholy of Resistance,
Exactly.
it is a kind of, it is where a terrible crowd, almost metaphysical crowd, descends on a village, and for no apparent purpose, just destroys everything. I mean, those of you who have seen the film, The Werkmeister Harmonies, Tara does a rather brilliant job of this, where you see this horde of people going into a hospital and beating people and possibly killing people. What is driving them? There's a little demon in Satantango, in the Melancholy of Resistance, a little who travels around with this great dead whale. I mean, dead whales in an enormous truck that moves at about 5 miles an hour through the streets. We see it moving from the beginning. And we understand that this truck is bringing with it a notion of annihilation. I mean, there's certainly a feeling that human society it's arbitrary, that it is always on the point of collapse, if you want. That is, go back to the Benjamin, that is always happening. And maybe that is one of the reasons for his great popularity, because we sort of feel that our nightmares can be a little apocalyptic, terrible things can happen. And he anticipates this, but he anticipates it as a human pattern. Mm-hmm. So it is something that is happening. When exactly do his books take place? Mm-hmm. We would imagine that Satantango's shortly, maybe after the fall of the old regime, but nothing's been sorted out. That is the part which, when people told me, why do you want to translate this depressing author? Because great art is not depressing. I think that's it. That is one of the crucial sort of understandings of art. Tragedy doesn't make you depressed. It transforms the notion of whatever is tragic in human existence. It's by somehow building it, by looking at the miracle of the building, that is the salvation. The human mind can conceive of a construction which can contain these terrible forces. And it doesn't sweeten it, it doesn't bring out a sort of superhero to sort things out. But we understand that we can comprehend the terrible. And its terrible isn't melodramatic. It just kind of carries on tipping over into ever more chaos, into ever more loss of meaning.
Thank you. Perhaps this would be the moment, because you mentioned tar, and not only tar, I must actually add that when we mention Béla Tar, we also should mention Ágnes Lehóczky, and not only Ágnes Lehóczky along with tar, but also the music, the
composer.
The composer, Mihály Víg. Sorry, yes. I can't actually see without the glasses. So the question will be, right after we watch 2 short episodes from Werkmeister Harmonies, so based on the novel Melancholy of Resistance, is how, I already know the answer. You did watch the films whilst translating the text. I will be really interested to hear a little more about the creative practices versus cinematography and how the film has perhaps helped the translation. And I'm actually thinking of the music as well, because I love Víg Mihály's stuff.
Shall I tell you the last translation I did?
Yeah.
There's a Hungarian band called Trabant. Has anybody heard of Trabant?
I think so.
Which is Víg Mihály's band. It is his lyrics I've been translating.
Brilliant.
They've come out now with the album of his music. So it's an interesting kind of set of connections.
It fits into the whole tonality of melancholy and depression and depressingness. But anyhow, so I've chosen 2 Valushka scenes. One is action-packed and one is slow motion. So it's going to be about 8 minutes the first scene and then about 5 minutes the next scene, we can cut it shorter if need to. I think we've got the time. So, but you've got the questions to think about whilst we are watching it. Thank you.
Mennyi lesz?
160.
Köszi.
So, cinematography and tar and translation and George.
They're great things. Tar is a genius in his way, as I think so is Krasznahorkai. You have something about the two scenes which you have seen, and then I want to think about the parallels between the two, who've worked a lot together. So I don't know how many, maybe 5, 6 films, maybe more. In the first scene, in which a bunch of drunks enact the eclipse of the sun, you have one comprehension of the state of the world. In the second, where this figure slowly, unremittingly goes to meet and stare into the eye of the dead whale, you have another related comprehension of the state of the world. The world is mysterious. The world is highly organized. Look at the eclipse. But when the eclipse happens, you're in complete darkness and there's a chaos. Nobody knows what to do. So, yep, Tar began by making quite short films about poor people in fairly desperate urban situations. And his films are black and white. As far as I know, he has not made any films in color. His films are slow. The black and white, if you like, is... I'm not saying that Tar is in some way consciously trying to find an equivalent of Krasznahorkai's prose. They are their own people, but they coincided and their visions sort of coincide. So in Tar's films, you get things in real time. If anybody does watch Satantango, the full 7.25 hours, and I recommend it, but with meals in between, which is how the ICA in London showed it a few years ago. You will see that Satantango, the beginning of Satantango, is a herd of cows moving from right to left. And their progress, you get about 7 or 8 minutes of nothing, but cows occasionally moving and then moving on. But that's not in the novel. But what that gives you a sense of is scale, that things are going to be happening very slowly. You're going to be watching things for a long time. And they're beautiful to look at. I mean, if what you want is a kind of more conventional film, you don't really get that. But you enter into a world which has parallels, I think, with Krasznahorkai's. The Vig Mihai music is beautiful. It's brilliant. The point at which the music starts in the first scene and when it comes up in the second, it's simple music. It's interesting that in his Nobel thanks, there was music on either side of his speech. The first was a pianist playing kurtag, but very simple sounding pieces. And I think the second one was Bach, wasn't it?
Bach, yes.
And that makes perfect sense in a way, that this is the highly complex system of Bach, which is a model of the universe. And if people love Bach, it's partly why they love him. It's why I love him. And then kurtag with its apparent simplicity, like the tune that begins. But these are Tar's decisions. And I understand Tar has given up making films. He says, I've done enough. And of course, there's a Satantango. There's also Damnation, which is script. So Krasznahorkai was script writer for the films based on his own books. Tar's done, and of course, they did the tour in horses, or La Torinoi Law. If you like slow, you'll love Torinoi Law. It's extraordinarily slow, but God, it's beautiful. An awful lot of it, what you see at the beginning, is a man driving a horse in front of a cart. You have to attune yourself a little bit to this. But it's immensely worth attuning yourself. I mean, you might just want to go afterwards and watch a James Bond film or or something like that, where an awful lot happens very, very quickly. But this is like turning the world around and seeing the other side of the moon. So I think in tempo, Tar's tempo is Krasznahorkai's syntax, if you like. The reason for Krasznahorkai's long sentences is much the same as Tar's long 5-6 minute shots of two people walking in a road, and you just tail along behind them for real time. And you get these changes, of course, in rhythm when you get the enactment of the moon, the eclipse of the sun. And then you get the long approach to this very, very slow, very enormous whale, which is advertised as the biggest whale in the world. Yeah, you can see why they did things together.
Before I move on to a couple of perhaps more difficult questions about characters and concepts of geopolitics, landscape, let's have a lighter question about humor and Krasznahorkai humor. And as I was watching the two scenes, I couldn't stop giggling because there's something absolutely hilariously funny about a scene which is also tragic-comic. The best way I could describe it is tragic-comic. But I was wondering, I also read several reviews on how actually Krasznahorkai is not an apocalyptic writer, but kind of ironizes a satire, a comedy of actually, we are talking about a comedy of apocalypse, and I can see that in the Tar scenes so much. But I was wondering if the English reader gets this, because I also find it incredibly Hungarian, particularly sort of 1980s.
Yeah, well, he's a contemporary of Nádas, of Esterházy, Lengyel, and there is a temper about it. It's fascinating. Other people might think of this very differently because all of these writers, I mean, particularly Esterházy, Nádas, and Krasznahorkai, are all pretty well known in English translation. Esterházy is the most difficult because he is very Budapest. His sense of irony and his sense of humor, if you like, is also it's very strongly in language. He's a great master of language. So it's terribly difficult to do Esterházy justice. Nádas is easier. There's a kind of, again, a strong Germanic precedent for the kind of writing that he has done. When I think of Hungarian humor, I think of something like Erkény, for example. If I think of Erkény, I think that's pretty dark humor most of the time, but it is at the same time funny. It's what used to be known as Budapest humor, which is a form of black humor. And it's black humor because it is dealing with very, very black subjects. So when people understand, I've often wondered what English readers make of Erkény, actually, because so much of it is dependent upon 30s, the war, Stalinism, straight after, and chiefly, in fact, the war and the modes of survival or lack of survival. And it's hard to know. And this is a much wider discussion than the particular one pertaining to Hungarian humor, is how far as a culture, as a civilization, England can share that Hungarian historical experience is so different from English, not on an individual level, but on a kind of, mass level. There are very different patterns. Britain is an island. Hungary is completely landlocked. Hungary has been overrun by people time and again. The Normans did it, but that was a long time ago. So there is this difference in consciousness. I remember there was one occasion when we were invited to the home of actually Vajda Miklós, who was there, but also with his wife, who was an editor, and also 2 or 3 other Hungarian writers. And they started telling each other jokes. And they would say to me, because Clarissa, my wife, doesn't speak Hungarian, says, translate that. Come on, you can translate that. And I think that's the most difficult thing in the world, is to translate a joke, actually. But yes, cultural expectations, anticipations, predispositions are, I think, very different. And that possibly explains a great deal in whatever happens on a political level as well. What was the question?
Whether it's possible to translate Hungarian humor or the Krasznahorkai humor.
Well, it seems to work. I mean, one thing is that I think that Tar's version of the apocalypse, of the eclipse, is funnier than Krasznahorkai's.
Yes.
Because when you slow it down between the visual and the written, there is a space, and that there are 2 things. They work differently. So watching drunkards reel about is actually funnier than reading about drunks reeling about. I mean, I think his description of the man trying to beat nails into a piece of wood is actually funny in writing. But it's hit and miss, and you're not going to know. You can only try your best, and you say, well, let's see if we can make this work. And that's why you can keep going back to a piece of translation. And basically, somebody, this is Paul Valéry, the French poet, who said, a work of art is never finished, it is only abandoned. And I think there is something in that. I mean, eventually it begins to feel finished simply because it's become a book, or it's become a paper, or it's become a film, or whatever it's done. But it doesn't, but you can be occupied for eternity with these things. And you'll be changing your mind, because one does change one's mind, and because circumstances change. Yeah. The bumper book of Hungarian jokes might be a long time in coming.
Let's quickly, I don't know how much time we've got. We haven't got a lot of time left, but we're going to try and sort of round the conversation up with a couple of more questions, maybe 3 more. So the next question is about, the humor and the tragic comic sort of element of the characters. In all the novels you've translated, with thinking of 3 here, but I'm specifically looking at Satantango tonight and Melancholy of Resistance, or we can just focus on Melancholy of Resistance. But either way, they're hugely interesting in the sense that they seem to come across as, I mean, Krasznahorkai himself talks a lot about syntax versus character, in the sense that most of the text is often one dramatic monologue flowing into the next dramatic monologue, and we're never quite sure whose dramatic monologue or stream of consciousness is being displayed on the page. But anyhow, going back to the characters, so I always thought, and yet again the Nobel speech reassured me in that I'm not thinking anything amateurish here, that he picks these sort of strange, quirky, weird kind of characters for his novel. They remind me of almost spokesmen some morality play. So you've got the fool, you've got the traitor, the drunk, the philosopher, the thinker. So there are these sort of specific roles. He almost like a stage director or a producer is sort of giving out to his characters, Krasznahorkai. But often putting the emphasis on the role of the outsider, what he then later on in his Nobel Prize speech, he calls the kind of wingless angel, or the victims of society, or the clocher. He comes up with this whole idea of the vagabond. So what do you think about these characters? And yes, one more question. There's often a sort of a sense of alienation from the reader when they come across these characters, in that they are quite unforgivingly also hold up a mirror to various social positions and roles.
Well, they are outsiders, but they're also obsessives. Practically all his major characters are obsessive. Esther, who's after the natural tuning. People with political obsessions, with cosmic, as in Volushka. But at the same time, Volushka is a victim. So Volushka is a simpleton, rejected by his mother, basically. That's what we discover in the book. So they're outsiders partly because they are fixated upon something, which also alienates them a little bit, because we find people with obsession slightly alienating, because they're so focused on something that they're not really capable of sharing. And Volushka's attempt to enact an apocalypse with the eclipse, I keep saying, sorry, enact it with a bunch of drunkards is as close as he gets to being a sort of an astronomer. I think that's part of the business. These are obsessive, caught up in systems, the systems that they're obsessed by, but also the bigger systems, which eventually eclipse them. So they are victims of that. There are no heroes as such. Everybody is, if they are part of a society, it is not a trusting, perfect society. That, I think, is the bleak aspect of his work. But it's also the amusing part, because to see this musicologist who's completely obsessed by natural tuning, but can't actually hammer something with his hands. They're overtaken by disasters. Volushka is overtaken by disaster. His mother is overtaken by disaster. In Satantango, there's one character, a little girl, who I was thinking of reading this passage, but I thought, no, maybe not. This little girl is another supposed simpleton. And at one point, she kills a cat. The killing of the cat, it's arbitrary. It just happens. She just feels that that's what she's got to do. And later she takes poison. And we see her funeral in Satantango, which is beautifully played by the various characters. A lot of the characters in Tar's films are people who move from film to film. And I say Tar, but I mean Kranitsky as well, who also acts in the films. So they are... That's how somebody senses the universe to be. It's like that. There's a system, and then suddenly the system goes wrong, and everything collapses. quite suddenly. You're living in a quiet village, you're working away at these problems and you're so helpless while you're obsessed by these natural tuning that you need looking after. But you need a simpleton Volushka bringing him food. So dependencies, separations, alienations. You don't have to take it as a sort of realistic picture of life out there. Everything in a really good piece of art is metaphor. Mm-hmm. It's metaphor. You're working within metaphors. Mm-hmm. And actually you know it when you're reading it. The settings are nearly always poor working class settings, village settings. That's where Krasznahorkai himself comes from, east part of Hungary, in Gyula, I think. Mm-hmm. But the situations are transparencies for some kind of sense of the workings of the universe. It sounds a bit grand, but I think that's the way it works.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the sort of setting, because that will be the next question and probably the penultimate one. And maybe it relates to the fact that there is a kind of universality about the setting of Krasznahorkai's locations. We're talking about, obviously, I remember when I was reading the Melancholy of Resistance, I know the town is not mentioned. There is no name for this town. It could be anywhere and nowhere. So is that the trick of making something so, for the Hungarian reader, obviously very Hungarian specific geopolitically?
I'll tell you something which is on the other side of that scale. In Háború és háború, in War and War, part of the action takes place in America, in New York. Mm-hmm. And he's very precise in describing where the character is. And in fact, I was curious, so I opened Google Maps and I followed the progress of the character, and you can. And at one point he goes down into a club, and lo, there's a club. And I asked him once about his location. He said, it's all incredibly precise. I know exactly where everything is. He has seen it, he has mapped it, which does not remove from its metaphoric aspect. Mm-hmm. Because you don't get complete narratives of people. You catch people at a certain time. But what matters is their position within the setting. I hope I'm being coherent. Yeah. Sometimes I feel I may not quite be. I'm doing my best.
You're very coherent to me, anyhow. It's okay. It's just okay. Thank you for the encouragement. Talking about site specificity, i.e. Krasznahorkai being always aware geopolitically where he is, but I still think maybe it's the power of metaphor, the metaphorical or the allegorical, that actually I can read it in a very universal way. And that also is true for his concept of home and homelessness, with his sort of vagabonds and hobos and outsiders and exilic human beings and fools. So when the Nobel Prize talk, during the Nobel Prize talk, he talks about deliberately paradoxical concepts like hope versus hopelessness, the fight between good and evil. Within the two, he reckons there is no hope. But of course we know that he also means there is. He cannot not speak in paradoxes, I find. And therefore his concept of homeland as well comes across very paradoxical, but hugely quirky and interesting in the sense that because you mentioned Valushka as being the kind of badly treated child, the kind of motherless child. Pretty much Krasznahorkai's definition fits your Valushka definition. And that's how he answers. My question is, reflection rather, commentary rather than, it's not a question, but knowing your work as well, as a kind of liminal being you are in many ways, in between languages, in between geographies, in between cultures, in between two homes or many more, in between identities. I think perhaps people who empirically experience the being outside of geography can identify exactly with how he defined the word home in that speech.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to any of that, really. I mean, because I haven't personally solved it for myself. I mean, what I do know, and back in about 1985, I was taken on a tour of courtyards in Pest, and I fell in love with them. And there was one particular courtyard in Pest, which is Magyarutca number 10. It's a through courtyard, and I fell in love with it. I'm still trying to think what I fell in love with, but I thought, and this will sound very melodramatic to you, and it does to me in a way, if I'm going to die, I'd like to die there. It's because... Why because? Because it seems in its space, in its period, in its noise level, it seems to exemplify something very valuable, a certain point of civilization with which I fully identify. So maybe it's something like that, but why does anybody form attachments of any sort? But I go back every time I go there, I revisit it. And I keep hoping it will not grow too tired on me. And it does a bit, but I think then I come in, and the day is right, and the light is right, and I think, yeah, I still think the same thing. So in a way, one can locate places, and I think Krasznahorkai locates places because they are very clear in his mind. But you universalize them, or you think that there is a quality to them which goes beyond your local Google map, or it goes beyond your architectural guide to Budapest. And it's nothing personal. It's not a courtyard I've ever lived in. Well, that's a very personal answer. But I think for people, a lot of people, I suspect, there are such kind of root experiences to which one relates in a kind of particularly positive way, without necessarily being able to explain why. And I have tried to explain it to myself, and that's about the best I have come up with. It was just perfect when I saw it. I thought it did have hope. So you could go back and experience that hope. Then there's the rest of the city.
Okay, and my final question is actually a book, a little quote from a book you translated, not recently, and it is the poetry of Ágnes Lehóczky. I actually used it for my doctorate.
I know.
That's why it's like that. That didn't happen recently. And in that, Ágnes Lehóczky talks about, actually quite Krasznahorkai Krasznahorkai-esque and Krasznahorkai-esquely melancholic, when for her we know that translation and literary translation was incredibly important, particularly in the 60s, 70s, when she wasn't allowed to do anything else. That's how actually she started writing, she started translating. But anyhow, she says this in the book that you translated, and it came out by Bloodex. Every language is unique. The Hungarian language is even more unique. If I were a linguist, I would sing hallelujahs from dawn to dusk for having been born a Hungarian and having been given one of the unusual languages of the Finno-Ugrian group at birth. As a poet, however, I'm not always rejoicing. The Hungarian language is isolated. The Hungarian language means certain death in word literature. And I deliberately, provocatively leaving it there because she continues in a little bit more hope than that, because she continues talking in that passage about the role of literary translation. And here's where you come in, obviously. So I was hoping, it's not a self-praise speech I'm expecting of you, but can you tell particularly young people who are here maybe today and are interested in how crucial it is and why it is important, particularly for small languages like Hungarian?
Oh, wow. The importance of translation.
Yeah. A bit of a small question, isn't it?
Well, but you make a distinction between translation from so-called world languages, so where people would be expected to have some knowledge of French, German, Spanish, maybe nowadays Chinese, maybe Arabic or whatever. Well, Hungarian is particularly isolated, isn't it? There isn't really anything like it. I had a Finnish colleague once who presented with a page of Finnish, asked me to read it. She said, "You pronounce very well. Do you know what it means?" I have no idea. So there's something in the... That is a big load to bear, I think, for a language, that isolation. On the other hand, it will give you a certain ingenuity, because you have to find your way in the world and you have to bring the world in to you. And that is the process of translation. Trouble is, there are not many of us translating Hungarian. There are about 5 or 6, let's say 7 or 8 to be generous. I don't know. But that's very, very few. And some of us, somebody else in the room here who does it, we're getting older. So we think what would be very nice if there were more young people who would be capable of translating. I mean, in a way, both Peter, who's sitting there, and myself, I mean, we're exactly the same age, and we came to England at exactly the same time. So we have had the experience of living kind of fully enough in one language and then pretty fully in another. It is as important for a translator to have a feeling for the language that they are translating into as the language they are translating from. Because what they have to find is a comparable space in the literary language of the target language. And I've been to lots of translator conferences, and there's lots of jargon to do with this, and some of it is interesting, but you have to have a sense of... In Hungary, almost, as far as I know, a lot of translators are actually writers. Here it is not necessarily the case. In fact, when I first started translating, I was told by a good friend and an excellent poet, "Don't do it. You'll be known as just a translator. like just, you know, and then you will become this other thing. And to some degree, I have. I mean, but who cares? It's gone. It's what you do, and Hungarian literature. There's a lot of it, and there's a lot of very good Hungarian literature. And I've only just done a tiny little bit. And much requires to be done.